Hi, welcome to class today. Today's topic is going to be evolution, and we're going to see how through the process of evolution we get so many diverse and amazing life forms to inhabit our planet. So, organic evolution, what this states is that all life on Earth descended from other life, sometimes changed significantly from ancestors. And we're going to see how this change can occur. Now, before we get into all of that, let's talk a little bit about the study and the organization of life. So, the science of taxonomy is the naming and organization of organisms. And this, the method or the way we organize life was first presented by Carolus Linnaeus, Carl von Linné, but remember this is back in the time when you Latinized your name if you were a scholar. And he came up with the idea of binomial nomenclature for species. Binomial meaning every species has a two-part name, the genus and the species. Like, for example, we are Homo sapiens. The genus Homo, the species Sapiens. And like my house cats, they're Felis domesticus. Now, in this binomial nomenclature, the names are always Latinized, the genus is always capitalized, and the species is lowercase. And so that's the standard way of writing down the name for any species that exist, and it goes all the way back to Carolus Linnaeus. Now, when we talk about what a species is exactly, species are members of a population that actually or potentially interbreed in nature and produce fertile offspring. So that's where you have to have the fertile offspring so they can, the offspring can then pass on their genetic code. And it's not just that the organisms can interbreed, it's that they naturally do that. They encounter each other in nature. So that's our definition of a species. Now, when we're looking at taxonomy, there's a hierarchy to this, where the biggest groups are what are called domains. And then we have the kingdom, the phylum, the class, the order, the family, the genus, and the species. So a domain contains many, many, many organisms. The species is this very individual group of organisms. So let's start with those domains. And this is interesting. When I went to college, the concept of domains did not yet quite exist. This is something by looking at the actual genetic code and looking at molecular biology and in depth at the cells that make up organisms, people found out that there's these domains that exist. And our first domain is archaea. And archaea are prokaryotes. A prokaryote is made up of cells, or is a cell that does not have any organelles in it. And so in archaea, these are simple cells, prokaryotes, like methane-producing bacteria and other extremophiles. And extremophiles are these organisms that especially like to live in extreme environments, like really, really hot springs, or acidic waters, or in rocks many kilometers beneath Earth's surface. Although some of these, not all of them are extremophiles. Some of them do live in dirt and seawater in much more ordinary places. So that's our archaea. Now there's another domain, which is bacteria. These guys are also prokaryotes, and they all contain muramic acid in their cell walls. And then there's the eukarya, or eukaryotes. All of these have cells with a nucleus and organelles, and we're part of this domain. Now, in your eukarya domain, there are four main kingdoms. Animalia, which is the kingdom we belong to, kingdom Plantae, fungi, and Protista. Those are four kingdoms within there. So that's basically how life is organized, right? That's this taxonomy of life. But let's talk about some of the early ideas about how life changes and evolves over time. And we're going to go to this gentleman here, Jean-Baptiste de Monnet, Chevalier de Lamarck. We just call him Lamarck. And you can see he lived from 1744 to 1829. And when he studied fossils, he recognized that there was this change in the fossils from the older ones to the newer ones. He could see that life slowly changed over time, and he started thinking, well, why and how would life change over time? And he assumed that these changes occurred because of an inner desire in the organism to change in some way. And one of the usual things that, or usual examples that are given are giraffes. Giraffes originally had, shorter necks, but according to Lamarck was like, well, the giraffes had this desire to get longer necks to reach up into the tops of trees. And so they'd like stretch and reach and somehow pass on these acquired traits to their offspring. And so we call that inheritance of acquired characteristics. So that would sort of be like if you had an inner desire to get bulked up like Arnold Schwarzenegger, and you worked out all the time, somehow you would pass that bulk and muscle to your offspring. Well, today, this seems like an odd idea to us, but at the time, when we're first looking at fossils and trying to really understand why and how these changes happened over time, this was a preliminary hypothesis. Now, one of his problems that Lamarck had was there was the question of, okay, so how do these traits that organisms acquire, how do they pass them on to their offspring? And that was a big drawback to his ideas. And, about 100 years later or so, we get Darwin's hypothesis or theory now of evolution through natural selection. And everyone remembers Charles Darwin as proposing this, but working at the same time was someone named Alfred Wallace, who came up with the same idea of natural selection. So Darwin actually sailed on an exploratory mission around the world on a British exploring vessel called the HMS Beagle. And when he was at the Galapagos Islands, he looked at the diversity of life there and started developing this idea of evolution through natural selection. That was all the way back in the 1840s. And he kind of sat on this idea for a long time because he really wanted to work out exactly how it worked, and he also knew it would be a controversial idea at the time. And then we get to around 1860, and Alfred Wallace was noticing the same things, except Alfred Wallace was working, I think in Indonesia or somewhere out there, and also was developing this idea of evolution through natural selection. But since he knew Darwin came up with the idea first, about 20 years earlier, Wallace actually kind of let Darwin publish first. And so the idea that these guys came up with, what exactly is evolution through natural selection? Well, they state that more organisms are born than survive into adulthood. Okay, so you have a lot more offspring than are going to grow to being an adult. And amongst these offspring, there's variation. Maybe one is bigger, maybe one is smaller, maybe one has a different coloration, maybe one has, I don't know, there's just some kind of variation amongst these offspring. And then these offspring must compete for all kinds of different things. They have to compete for food, for shelter, for habitat, for sexual partners. And this results in the survival of the more fit and the elimination of the less fit. Because maybe some of that variation in those offspring makes it easier for them to get food, or maybe some of the variation makes it easier for them to find or create shelter of some kind. Sometimes when you see really weird things like some of the odd colors and feathers and stuff on birds, and you're kind of like, why would that be the thing that helps them survive? Well, it's because the sexual partner happens to like whatever that is, and so those birds are able to pass on their genetic code. And so this is the basic idea of evolution through natural selection. There are these traits that are more favorable to have in nature, and nature will select those offspring to survive, and the others do not. Now, Darwin did recognize that he had the same problem, though, that Lamarck had. He was like, well, he didn't know quite what caused the variability, and he didn't know why or how the offspring inherited traits, because this was before we really had a concept of genetics and genes and chromosomes and all of that sort of thing. And that was one of the things that kind of held Darwin back from wanting to publish. Was he did recognize that at the time he didn't have the whole picture, but he did observe this natural selection in nature and knew that was right, even if he didn't have quite all the pieces. So a little bit later we get to find out how those traits are passed from parent to offspring. And some of the early genetic studies were conducted by this priest here named Gregor Mendel. And he did a bunch of experiments with plants, especially pea plants. And he looked at their different traits, like the color of peas they produced, how tall they'd grow, what color flowers they had, things like that. And over time, he figured out that there are what are known as, or what are now known as, genes. And the gene is a unit of heredity that carries a specific characteristic. So you might have a gene for green eyes, or a gene for brown eyes, or a gene for being dark-haired or being light-haired, right? There's this thing that carries that specific characteristic. And now we also know that we have these chromosomes in our cells. And the chromosome is a structure in the nucleus of a cell that carries the genes. So we have this chromosome that carries our genes, and those genes are actually the DNA that we have. And so this DNA, that stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. And genes are segments of this DNA molecule. So we have these segments of the DNA, right? Those are the genes that go into the DNA molecule that makes up the chromosomes that we have. Now, chromosomes in a normal cell occur in what are called duplicate pairs. So, for example, humans have 46 chromosomes. We have 23 pairs of chromosomes, so a total of 46 in our cells. And we call this diploid. Diploid refers to a cell that has these duplicate pairs of chromosomes. And the majority of our cells are diploid. However, there are some haploid cells. And this is a cell that does not contain the paired chromosomes. And those are the sex cells, are haploid. So for all of those of you who are sitting there saying, I didn't want to take biology, well, guess what? Geology, if you really want to understand the history of our planet and the history of the life on our planet, you got to have at least a basic understanding of some biological principles. So we're going to take a look at cell division because this will explain how we get diploid cells, how we get haploid cells, and how we get some of the variability in offspring that Darwin was noticing that ultimately leads to natural selection. So let's start with mitosis. Mitosis is cell division that forms two diploid cells that are the exact replicas of the parent cell. And this is what happens in typical ordinary tissue growth, right? You're always creating new skin cells and stuff like that. Well, this is what happens. You have this mitosis going on. Now this is different from meiosis, and this is cell division that forms four haploid cells. And during the process of meiosis, you can have things like chromosomal crossover that occurs. And this is one of the things that can increase genetic variability. And we'll take a look at exactly what this chromosomal crossover is in just a moment. Now, meiosis ultimately produces the sex cells, the reproductive cells that we call gametes, and that's the sperm and the egg cells. Now, in biology, you would have to know all of the prophase, metaphase, anaphase. I don't need you to know that in this class, but what I want you to realize is if we follow mitosis, we start off with our parent cell, right? And then the parent cell duplicates the chromosomes. The chromosomes line up and then split apart. So ultimately we end up with two of these daughter cells that are exact replicas of the original parent cell. Like I said, that's your typical normal cell growth in your body. Now in meiosis, what happens is you have your parent cell and you're going to get this chromosome, this duplication, but what sometimes happens is this crossover where some of the chromosomes actually swap. They swap some data with each other, right? And that's why we're showing now that this little blue chromosome has a snippet of the red one, and the red chromosome has a snippet of the blue one, right? And so this is going to increase some of the variability in the organisms. And then we have the cells split a couple of times, and thus we get our four haploid cells, and there you can see where that chromosomal crossover occurred, and this is one of the things that allows for quite a bit of variability amongst organisms, is this meiosis and some of the chromosomal crossover that can happen during that time. Alright, now when organisms reproduce, there are a few different strategies for reproduction. You can have asexual reproduction, and this results in genetically identical daughter organisms. This is like, I'm sure everyone's seen the amoeba splitting in two, right? You start with one amoeba, it splits, now you have two of them, and they're genetically identical to each other. Now, there is an advantage to having this asexual reproduction. You can have rapid reproduction when conditions are favorable. So if the conditions are like really nice for whatever this organism is, you can have lots of reproduction and rapidly create many more of these organisms. The disadvantage to this is that it does produce limited genetic variability. So these things are not going to change as frequently or as quickly as other organisms because you have that limited variability in the genes. Now, the other type of reproduction that can happen is sexual reproduction. And this requires two parents. Now, there is an exception called parthenogenesis. Parthenogenesis can happen in, let's see, like fish, amphibians, reptiles, and I believe it's also being documented in birds. And that's where you have a female parent that can actually basically create viable offspring without having a sexual partner. So that's parthenogenesis is just one of these really interesting things that can happen. Now, in sexual reproduction, you have these two haploid gametes meeting, right? They have half the number of chromosomes that they're supposed to have. And what happens? The sperm enters the egg to form a zygote. And the zygote is a single diploid cell with half the chromosomes from each parent. So these two haploid cells come together, form the zygote, and now have formed a diploid cell, the typical cell that that makes up the majority of the cells in your body. And because we got half of the genetic code from each parent, that provides some genetic variability. So after we get the zygote, mitosis proceeds, and ultimately we get the entire adult organism eventually growing. The advantage is that this causes greater genetic variability in offspring. So when you have that greater genetic variability, nature can select the fittest organisms according to whatever traits are favorable, and thus you can have different organisms evolving to inhabit different parts of the planet.